Okay, thank you everybody for joining the Children and Families SIG webinar on Ecological Momentary Assessment. We have three wonderful speakers here today, Abi Pickard from the University of Edinburgh, Cindy Forbes from the University of Hull, and Chelsea Kracht from the University of Kansas. So we're going to have the three presentations first, and then we'll take questions at the end. So if everybody could put their questions into the Q&A feature, and then we'll answer those at the end. So Abi, I will hand over to you now for your presentation, if you wanted to share your screen.
Yeah, thank you, Alissa. I'll just go ahead and share. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yep.
Is that sharing now?
That's what, yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
You just need. Perfect.
Okay,
Thanks.
perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, Alissa, and thank you for the invitation to present on our ecological momentary assessment that we conducted as part of the Appetite project, which was a much larger 3-year project looking at avid eating behaviours in children. So when I refer to avid eating behaviours, I'm talking specifically about 3 to 5-year-old children who have a high food approach, so often ask for snacks, want more food, tend to be constantly hungry. And we wanted to look at what parents' responses are in reaction to those children's demands and requests for food. So just because this is the start presentation, a bit of background about ecological momentary assessment. I'm sure many of you will have heard about it. But in brief, to explain it, participants would complete short surveys about their behaviour or experiences or their emotions across the day for a short period of time. So for example, 1 week, or in our case, it was 10 days. And what's really good about it is it captures that real-time information about what people are doing, what they're experiencing, and their emotions. And so as you can imagine, this is really good for things like eating behaviour, which happens several times throughout the day, but also when we're looking at avid eating behaviour in children, they will request food a lot of times throughout the day. So we wanted to capture things like stress and mood around those requests for food and those eating occasions. And the reason why we went with EMA is because as part of the Appetite work package, we had conducted other studies as well. So we'd looked at cross-sectional data and conducting online surveys. We'd also done some qualitative data where we'd interviewed parents. But what's good about EMA is that it's more ecologically valid. So it reduces that recall bias because a parent is filling out how they're feeling, what's going on, and their behaviours at the time that it happens. And because of our everyday use of smartphones, it's become so easy to capture this kind of data. And there's several apps that will support the use of ecological momentary assessment. And then what's really good is because it collects so much data from one individual, you can look at both those within and between subject effects. So the reason why EMA was particularly apt for parental feeding practices is because they can look so different depending on context and emotions and what's going on in the scenario and the child themselves. So parents will often be doing other things as well as trying to prepare meals or have a meal time with their child. So we wanted to capture all that data when we were asking parents. And what we found from previous research that had used EMA with parents and their feeding practices is that they vary so much depending on the context and even depending on things like what day it is, what the time is, whether there are other people present. Parental stress was a big thing, so we obviously wanted to capture that. We also wanted to look at where the food is eaten. So for example, snacks on the sofa compared to a meal around the dinner table, and the types of foods being eaten. So whether it was restriction of certain foods like desserts and things, as all the previous literature using EMA has shown us that these impact then the feeding practices that a parent will employ. So the study aimed to look at how variation in parents' mood, their feeding goals, and the context of the eating occasions affected the feeding practice that they then used with their child. And we initially planned to have 200 parents or caregivers of a preschool child, so 3 to 5 years old, with avid eating behaviour. And how we defined avid eating behaviour was this high food approach that I mentioned. So children who tend to always be hungry, always asking for more food, very responsive to food cues in their environment. And we captured that using the child eating behaviour questionnaire. And then I conducted latent profile analysis to see which children fell into an avid eating profile. And then the method, of course, was a 10-day EMA period. So parents answered a baseline questionnaire at the start, and then they did an end of study questionnaire, which was also to capture things like feasibility and acceptability. And I'll just ask Antonio to share his screen to show a short video explaining to the parents what they'll be required to do during the EMA period.
Go through all of the different types of surveys in this study. The first type of survey I'm going to tell you about today is a random survey. So that we can assess your mood throughout the day, you'll receive 4 notifications at random times. We'll also send you a notification at the end of each day to complete a survey to check how your day has been. When there's a survey ready for you to complete, you'll receive a notification on your phone from the XBWell app. Simply click on the notification and it will take you straight to the survey where you can complete it. I'm now going to tell you about the types of situations where your child asks for food, even if they don't end up getting food. For example, if they ask for a snack, but dinner is nearly ready. Because we don't know when these situations will happen, we need you to log it in the XBWell app. You can do this by opening up the XBWell app and clicking on a food survey. We're also interested in situations when your child eats food when you're present, for example, a meal or a snack time. After your child has finished eating, please open up the XBWell app on your phone and click on a food survey. For each type of survey, it's important
Antonio,
that you complete
good.
them as soon as possible. This is because we're interested.
I'll
Go ahead, Abby.
Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and share my PowerPoint again. Oh. Is that all good?
Yes.
Yep, that's good. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. So that was just to hopefully give you a brief overview of what the parents were asked to do and the different types of surveys that are involved, because with EMA, I think the most traditional one is the signal surveys. So they would be sent through to a participant's phone, and then they're the ones that they would then have like half an hour or an hour to respond to. What we factored into this protocol is that it might be slightly more difficult because we have to ask parents to actively go into the app if the child requests food or has an eating occasion. And so we thought this might be more difficult because obviously meal times can be quite stressful with children, and we weren't sure how responsive parents would be to then open up the app and tell us about the eating occasion. So this is just a quick overview of the schedule of the day. So as Katie mentioned, there were 4 surveys that would go out and just ask about parents' overall well-being and how they were feeling. And then they would also complete food surveys and requests for foods to figure out what parental feeding practices were being used at that time. And that was very much dependent on the parent. So also when the notification surveys came through and the end of day surveys, the parent was also asked, have you forgotten to report any eating occasion today? And if they answered yes, then they were prompted to fill out a food survey. So just a little bit of an overview of how feasible the study was. I'd say in general, it worked really well with the parents. For the 10 days that they were taking part in the EMA study, they were very responsive. And if they did have any issues, they would contact us very quickly and try and resolve them. it is worth noting that for this study, we did reimburse participants £100 at the end of the study, and that was prorated depending on how many complete days of the EMA study they completed. So we do think that was a very good incentive for parents. So just on the left here, you can see some of the numbers. So we invited 312 to participate. We had 122 that were onboarded and completed the initial survey. And then of those 122, we had 118 with completed data. So that was classed as 7 full days of ecological momentary assessment data to work with. And as you can see on the right, we had a really good response rate over the 10 days. So always averaging pretty much above 70%. That first day is just obviously when they were onboarded to the study. And then in terms of acceptability, we also asked parents how they actually found doing the study, whether it was burdensome, because as you can imagine with children, especially if you have a child that displays avid eating behaviour and is constantly asking for food, it might be then difficult to add in an extra element of responding to surveys and telling us more about those eating occasions. And what was good is that we got a lot of positive response. So most of the parents said that they weren't bothered by them, it wasn't burdensome, or if so, it was just a little bit. So that was quite a good indication. And parents did ultimately say that they would be happy to take part in another similar study. In terms of what it could tell us about those real-time meal contexts, we were able to get a really good idea of how feeding practices do differ, especially for meals and snacks. And that was one of the important things, because one of the guidelines that it led on to was that you should have tailored advice for what parents should do during meal times versus what parents should do during snack times. So we could see a significant difference across all feeding practices in meals and snacks. And then in terms of the feeding goal, that was also interesting in that if it was the child that had initiated the request for food, then the parent's main goal was to reduce stress, which you can imagine is very common if they're in a supermarket and a child asks for a snack, then the parent's goal will then be to avoid conflict or reduce the stress. Whereas if it was parent-initiated mealtime or snack, then health would be the main goal that parents would employ. So just to quickly conclude, we found that EMA was feasible with a really good completion rate. So we had 96.7% who completed the full 10-day period. And then 7 days of those had full complete EMA data. So we counted that as either 2 requests or eating occasions, as well as 2 of the notification surveys, so the ones that asked about their mood and how they were feeling. And the majority did not find them burdensome, but they did say that it was good in increasing their awareness of their feelings and actually their feeding behaviours. So what would be really interesting is to see whether continuing to do this study would shift over time the feeding practices that they use at different meal times. And we got a wealth of data. So we had 2,500 eating and food request events across the 118 parents, which was really good because we were able to look at differences in things like coercive feeding practices and when they were used and what the predictors were. And then also parents reported fewer events during the EMA than their initial estimates. So that's just one point to note about the feasibility and acceptability, in that parents often tended to say that their child would request food 4 or 5 times a day on average in the baseline reports. But then what we were actually seeing is that they would only log 2 or 3 maximum in the actual EMA period. So it suggests some underreporting, which, as you'd imagine, could be quite common if a parent is having a very busy life trying to manage the children and also complete the study at the same time. So what it gives us for future directions is technical difficulties always seem to happen. And there are certain platforms that are better and worse at handling technical difficulties. So it is really important to test and design the app and do as many pilot studies as possible. And then also with things like parenting, design adaptations may be needed for diverse schedules, but also for different participants. So parents who don't tend to eat with their children, or for example, parents who might have a really hectic schedule with their child so that the child is eating in the car, it's not always practical to sit down at the table and eat a meal together. It's always important to consider being able to tailor those across the EMA platform. And then the monetary compensation was also a big drive for our completion rates. So participants should be compensated, especially because it is quite an intensive way of collecting data. And then integrating participant feedback is key for larger scale implementation. So after we finished the study, we then invited the parents who'd taken part back to do focus groups with the intention of developing some sort of intervention or blueprint that parents could then use if it was a stressful mealtime. So that's all I have on our EMA work, but just a big thanks to everyone who took part in the research and our steering group, but also all of the researchers that collaborated on this project. And then here are some of the links to some of the papers that we've produced from this EMA study. So we have the protocol paper, and then we did the feasibility paper, and then we have the predicting coercive feeding practices. So that was the main hypothesis-driven paper for us. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Abi. As I said, we'll hold questions until the end, so you can pop them in the Q&A chat now as you think of them, and we'll get them all answered at the end. So we'll move on to our next presenter, who is Cindy Forbes, and I will hand over to you now, Cindy, sorry.
Not the first time, don't worry about that. All right. Now, I'm a bit of an odd person out here in that I am part of the Cancer Prevention and Management Group. Is it viewable? You can see that? Okay.
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Alissa. Yes, so I'm part of the Cancer Prevention Management, but I think that the EMA kind of methodology I've used before in the past. So I'm here to give you a bit of an overview of how we did that in my kind of area of research. So firstly, just thanks very much for the invitation to contribute. So I'm very happy to talk about this project. We did this a while back, looking at how people post-cancer diagnosis might engage with technologies like smartphones as well as wearable activity trackers to help them manage their physical activity levels. This was linked to a fellowship I did as part of something called the Get a Move On Network, which was set up by Professor Anna Cox at UCL, so University College London, and funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council in the United Kingdom. I'll give you a bit of a brief background, an overview of the methods I used, and some results and lessons learned. I'm not going to talk about the merits of EMAs, as Abi's already gone into that a bit, and I think that we can just keep going on that. So, since the 90s, the number of cancer diagnoses has generally increased in the UK and actually worldwide as well. And by 2040, I have 2024 in my notes. By 2040, we expect the rates among those 65 plus will actually go up by about 40%. Physical activity has been shown to be beneficial for people with during and after cancer treatment, as well as it's safe, it's feasible, and it helps improve quality of life, manage the side effects both from cancer and cancer treatment, and it helps reduce recovery time. And we even now know that there is growing evidence showing it can help reduce recurrence and improve survival. A bit more specific, it's a busy slide, but this is the 2019 physical activity guidelines for people with cancer. And we know enough now, as I said, that we can actually prescribe specific doses of exercise for people based on specific kinds of treatment side effects. So for example, cancer-related fatigue, we can give a specific prescription for that, for example. But health-related quality of life, physical function, reducing anxiety and depression, it has no effect on lymphedema. And there's actually more evidence now showing that it's beneficial for bone health and sleep as well. However, most people with a cancer diagnosis don't actually get enough activity to gain any of these benefits, with about nearly 80% globally not meeting these guidelines. Supervised programs versus unsupervised. So we tend to have better outcomes with people who have gone through supervised programs, but unsupervised programs are still better than nothing. And when we've actually asked people what their preferences were, they've told us that they prefer to do activity when, where, and with whom they want. So they don't really want to have to travel somewhere if they don't want to, for example. So digital technology, we think, can help support this activity at a distance, or these remotely delivered activity kind of programs. And we wanted to see how we might do that. Some of the things that we looked at, so we know from the literature that wearable activity trackers like Fitbits can help with goal setting, self-monitoring, feedback, and prompting. So it can help prompt people to get up and move around. And there's options for digital personalized physical activity programs, either, completely computer tailored or just delivered via telehealth, for example. This feedback can be personal and professional. It can be delivered by an actual person via telehealth. It can be delivered completely artificial intelligence. And it's actually been shown to be feasible among both general and chronic disease populations, including people with cancer. A bit more in depth as well, technologies have been shown to support quality of life and independence among populations like people who have had cardiac events or strokes, so that rehabilitation, people with dementia, or even the frail elderly to help aging in place. So mostly this revolves around computer-tailored programs again and telehealth consults. Some studies have used activity trackers or step counters on a smartphone, and found a link between the number of steps taken per day and risk of frailty and improved quality of life, for example. So in order to understand what older adults with cancer diagnosis might need to engage with digital technology, we needed to know what they think about physical activity in general and digital technology in general. What we actually did was we wanted to see the wearable activity trackers, and we picked Fitbits for this, and we wanted to give out smartphone-based surveys, and that's our EMAs. So we looked for adults post-treatment for any cancer type. So as long as they were post-adjuvant treatment, which means their main kind of cancer treatment, they could be on hormone therapy or immunotherapy if it was long-term. We didn't want anybody currently using activity trackers, so they could have used one in the past, but we were looking for people who were relatively naive to activity trackers, and we wanted people who were living in England or Wales based on our ethics application. There were three main parts to this study. We had an observational 6 weeks where people were given a Fitbit. They used it for 6 weeks, and we had those ecological momentary assessments for the same 6 weeks. We also had pre and post surveys, semi-structured interviews after follow-up, as well as virtual workshops to kind of plan next steps. I'm going to focus on the 6-week period as well as the follow-up interviews and what we learned from those in this today. So we sent out Fitbits to people in the mail. So in the post, we had given them basically really no instructions on what we wanted them to do with it. We just said, use it however you like, take this 6 weeks, we didn't say set goals, set a specific step count, set any kind of thing. We didn't give them any prescription. And we just wanted to see what they would do with it, really. And we had these Peel survey apps pop up on their smartphones twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. And they would randomly generate between a predetermined time range. So within a couple hours, there was an hour or two time range that we set that this notification could pop up. In terms of what we asked people in this study, we firstly asked them the time of day. So what time was it? Obviously, we needed to know, based on branching, what questions to ask. So if it was the morning, we would ask them how confident they were, for example, to meet their goals for physical activity. Both times of day, we would ask about, mood. So do you feel more happy or sad right now? We'd asked about anxiety, more anxious, tense, or are you calm and relaxed right now? We also asked about fatigue and pain levels. And that happened at both times of the day to see if they changed from morning to evening. We asked about device frustration. So, was there anything that was irritating them about the device? Did they have any issues with it? Did they talk to anybody about the device itself? Did anybody ask them about it? Did they talk about it to anybody? Did they use specific features? Were they liked, disliked, and all that kind of thing? So as I said, this was a morning question, and then we would ask in the evening, did you meet your goal? And if so, how did you feel about that? And that sort of thing. We did ask also any other comments. So there was an open-ended at the end that people could kind of give us any additional information that they were looking at. As well, we just wanted to know if they were actually wearing it, and if they weren't, why? So we asked them some open-ended questions as well. Our follow-up interviews were after the 6-week time period, and this was essentially to get just a deeper understanding of a broad kind of things in terms of what their diagnosis and recovery felt like, their attitudes for behavior change around physical activity in particular, how they were feeling with everything, particularly if they were quite recent cancer diagnoses. And of course, the acceptability of the device, i.e. the Fitbit and the EMAs themselves. We managed to recruit just a small sample, but we had, and this was, so we recruited via social media and cancer support groups. So we have no idea really how many people we reached in terms of who saw our advertisement and our call to recruitment. But we had 30 people reach out to us, and 27 ended up consenting. Of those, mostly breast cancer. The majority were women, about 53 years of age, and 93% of them, so all but 2, were in the Yorkshire region. You can see the retention was a bit different based on what we were looking at. So Qualtrics surveys were, majority were filled out, so just fine. So 96% actually filled them out. EMAs, we had 93% at least provide some data. No, that's not complete. I'll show you that in a second. Fitbits were, the way we got those was a detailed archive download. So we got those afterwards. We also had week-to-week summaries, but 85% or 23 out of 27 provided that full archive download. And we ended up with 23 people completing follow-up interviews. In terms of adherence for the EMAs, I mean, when you think about it, we had, I think it was 84 potential surveys for each person. So an adherence rate of 72% is quite good. So each person twice a day over 6 weeks, there's a potential there for 84 surveys. And to have 72%, that's not bad. If you take out the 2 people that you can see there who did nothing, none of them, then we would have 78%. So it's a pretty high adherence rate, considering it was quite a long amount of time. In general, people found that the Fitbit was helpful. And it mostly made them more aware. So there was that self-reflection there. It made them more aware of what they were doing. The prompts actually worked. And I don't know if anybody here actually has a Fitbit, but sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. They can be quite easy to ignore over time. But the EMAs as well were said to allow a bit of self-reflection. So at the end of the day, in particular, the questions kind of asked, mood, how you're feeling, just a general kind of sense of your day, I suppose. And it allowed them to kind of think back and be like, oh, well, today wasn't so bad, or I had a worse day, but that's okay. And so we got quite a few of those kind of comments in our open-ended questions at the end. They also kind of said that the EMAs were, they fostered a bit of a connection between us as the researchers, which was interesting because we didn't build in any connection, or we didn't build in any like touch points with them other than if they were having technical difficulties. So a couple of them did, but even if we didn't talk to them at all throughout the 6 weeks, they did say that they felt like somebody was there to take care of them. They filled out these questionnaires. They knew somebody was going to look at them, and then they felt pretty good about, having that fostered a sense of connection, which happens often, I think, with people with cancer. Once they're done their treatments, they're kind of like, okay, good luck and see you in 6 months for your next scan, that kind of thing. A few little interesting things that I just wanted to highlight. The overall steps actually decreased. We started this in November, and if anybody's familiar with the weather in the United Kingdom and in England, particularly during November, it starts to rain quite a lot. It gets quite cold. So I think some of this was people not wanting to go outside, and the interviews actually told us they would have done better in summer. So there was a bit of that. They didn't think the EMAs were bothersome at all. They didn't like missing them. A lot of people that did end up missing them were irritated about that. They didn't like that. And they would have liked to have been able to set their own time frame that worked for them a bit better. So, in the morning, 7 to 9 instead of 8 to 10, for example. And they wanted to be able to add more context. If they were having a bad day, they wanted to be able to say why. If they were really fatigued, perhaps it wasn't just cancer-related fatigue. Perhaps it was they did something really big the day before that's just gotten them tired. And part of that was the Fitbit as well. So if they had a bad day, they'd like to turn off those prompts to move because they're not going to. So they're just ignoring them anyway. They didn't really do a lot of different things with the Fitbits, so they didn't explore much about it. They just kind of slapped them on and went for it, which was interesting as well. So our main analysis is going to be looking at the impact of those Fitbits and the EMAs on habit formation. That was kind of something I didn't mention, but that's the pre-post surveys. We did look at that sort of stuff. We want to also look at the impact on a morning versus evening EMA measure. Was there activity in between that then helped somebody, for example, feel better, have less pain, have less fatigue, and all that kind of thing. And then we're looking at exploring the just-in-time activity interventions and how that might look, but that's a bit away. I'll just say thank you to the collaborators and thank you to my teammates here. You can see Jordan, Max, Kathy, and Danny. And I will end there, and there'll be questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Cindy. I don't know why I struggle over that. All right, the next presenter we have is Chelsea Kracht. So I will hand over to you now, Chelsea. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks again for the opportunity to present. And I think Abi and Cindy have done such a great job introducing EMA. So I'm excited to kind of round it out and provide some more practical tips for EMA, especially for children and families. I would like to note my work will be across a couple studies here, and most of my work is in physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep, what we call the 24-hour movement behaviors or movement behaviors. So that's what I'll be focusing on today. So as an overview of my presentation, I am going to talk about 3 separate studies. I'm just going to give you some considerations from these studies and how we've kind of evolved as we've gone through each of them. First, I'll talk about timing and prompts and when to do it and maybe for how long. And then I'll talk about the parent perspective, survey availability, and leveraging data across days to look at some patterns. So the first study I'll present here is about adolescents. We had 284 adolescents. This is baseline analysis of a prospective study. So we just did EMA during the first part of the study. It was just for 7 days. We had these adolescents were around 12 years old, so it's still kind of on the younger age, but we did random interval-based sampling. So that means that we had 2-hour intervals. Within those intervals, you'd get a prompt to complete a survey. It was available for 30 minutes. You would get these random intervals for various amounts depending on the day. On our main results, we primarily looked at affect, so the positive and negative affect scale, the context, and then an accelerometer based measure of their physical activity and sedentary time 30 minutes preceding when they answered the prompt. And what we found was being alone and indoors was related to additional time spent sedentary. So if you were alone indoors, you would report more time in that sedentary time based on the accelerometer. But the one thing that stood out to us is that our compliance was quite variable. So across 7 days, some people completed none and some people completed quite a lot. And that really led us into some considerations for how to do it in the future. So first, I do have to acknowledge that usually completion rates are slightly lower in the adolescent age range. So we might see 60 to 70%. But this was quite low, which made us look a little bit more. We did look at age, sex, and BMI and household income, and it didn't differ by any of those characteristics. So it really made us think about maybe it's the schedule. And one of the things that we thought about is a common thing you'll hear in children is that, children are not small adults. Well, adolescents are not small adults for many reasons, but just taking away that 8 to 4 time frame when they're in school might not be the only time frame you need to think about. So what I have here, and I'm showing you here in table 1, is our current schedule. And even taking out that 8 to 4, some other things to consider is that adolescents have different sleep patterns on the weekends. So they may be sleeping in and missing some of the prompts, but they also may have their own screen limitations. And this study was conducted about 4 or 5 years ago, but in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of changes to the way adolescents use phones and also more restrictions on them as well. So my solution is to definitely talk to your CAB or end users and see what their schedule is, and if your schedule could, or your EMA schedule would fit within the current adolescent world, I would say. The other thing is this is a delicate balance of prompting and time to complete. And this is where we really started to change what we did is so the 2 hours and 30 minutes to complete, if you did that 6 times, you have 3 hours to answer a prompt. But you could also change it to be 3-hour blocks with 1 hour or maybe even 45 minutes to answer the prompt. So you would be prompting them less, but there'd be more time for them to complete the prompt. And that really made us think about, should we be prompting them more or giving them more time to respond? And so what I'm showing you here on this bottom table is a little bit larger time to complete it, again, adjusting it for the weekend and even adding in a fixed survey. So we've seen this in the other 2 presenters. They had a survey that was always there to answer survey questions about patterns and what happened during the day, rather than what was just happening right there. And so this really made us think about how are we, especially looking at the 24-hour day, and how can we make the compliance go up just a little bit. This led us to our other study. This is parents of young children who are 3 to 5 years old who do not meet the 24-hour movement guidelines. As you may know, the 24-hour movement guidelines is an integrated behavior approach that has guidelines for physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep. Though I can't say there's one thing to characterize this population, it's usually high screen time, short sleep, high screen time, low physical activity. What this looks like in context is usually these families have shifted schedules. So usually a parent works shift work, or they also might be overbooked. So there's a lot of just schedule conflicts going on with the older sibling has a bunch of sports, and so the younger sibling is tagged along. There's also usually permissive parenting and various bedtime practices, I will say, within this population. What we updated on the EMA end is that we did make those random interval-based surveys a little bit longer, and then we added a fixed survey. So we added a fixed survey in the morning and evening to learn a little bit more about the sleep during the day and their bedtime practices. I want to go back to Abby's presentation when she discussed incentives. We added incentives for this. So if they reached a certain bar, they would get paid a certain amount of US dollars. We also had multiple check-ins during the 14-day period. So we'd check in a couple days in if they were doing well, or maybe they weren't, so we could troubleshoot anything really early. Now, the purpose of this study was to see really factors that were related to movement behaviors during the day. And so what we found was that parent stress and our momentary household chaos question was actually not related to physical activity and screen time. This was kind of surprising, but I think it's because screen time is on quite a lot in this sample, and physical activity is usually a little bit more context specific as well. The other thing we found, which was related to our other investigation, was being alone was related to being sedentary and screen time. So what we did with this sample is that we not only asked the parent what level of physical activity the child was in, so sedentary, light, moderate, and vigorous, and provide some child-specific prompts, but we also said, are they engaging in screen time? And if so, what type of screen time? Screen time for fun or screen time for education? We made that question not contingent on their physical activity reported level. And part of that is because we didn't want to stigmatize that screens are always sedentary. But I will say most of the screens, they were sedentary. I think like 10% of them, they were actually engaged in like light activity. So thinking through this study, here's some things I would recommend or just considerations and lessons learned. One of the first things is to always make sure that it's about the parent's experience. So making sure the parent who's going to download the phone is there, or download the app is there. making sure that it's a very good orientation. So I think Abi showed the video that's perfect, really describing what is the purpose of these surveys, how they're going to impact future interventions, and also thinking about how you can be welcoming. Within this sample specifically, we had a lot of high screen time, and we know screen time is very stigmatized. And so we told our parents we want the good, bad, and ugly. We really want to make sure we understand what's going on in the home environment. I think that was very helpful so that people weren't saying, oh, my kid's active and not on screens the entire time. The other thing I would recommend is to think about the reactivity. So going back to other presentations, being monitored on the amount of time your child is on a screen or you're not with a child can start to change behaviors just a little bit, but it does help parents reflect on things and sometimes may impact their willingness to do future surveys throughout the period or even just complete the study. So what we did is when we pinged them during those random interval prompts, we said, are you with your child, yes or no? And we still got some information from the parent. What we didn't want to have happen is that the parents say, oh, I'm not with my child, this survey doesn't count. We wanted to say it does count. And as you can see here in the figure, the amount of time they're actually with their child kind of varied depending on the day or time of day, but we did still have high compliance and we did reward them for completing those surveys. The other thing I will say, especially with parents, is think about if you couldn't do the schedule and you couldn't achieve the incentive barriers, then your participants probably can't. And a lot of us have small children who may be at an away from care or away from home situation. And again, how would you feel if you were not getting incentivized for completing those surveys? The other thing I would like to emphasize here is the importance of thinking beyond random interval-based sampling and thinking about those fixed surveys. I know they're not as exciting as prompting people within the day, but you do get a lot of rich data. What we added into our study was a little bit more about the bedtime ritual and sleep and a lot of these night awakenings. And what we found, which we hadn't really explored before, was that bedtime rituals, so doing a bedtime routine, happened at the same time as having screen time before bed. What ended up happening in our semi-structured interviews that happened after the 14 days is parents really actually did do this. So they would commonly describe a bath, Bluey bed. Bluey is a common child show that's about 7 minutes long, and a lot of parents described it being part of the bedtime routine. The reason why this is important is that usually children who have sleep problems, people say, oh, do a bedtime routine. But here we learned based on, again, this EMA that really it's not what's like you're doing a bedtime routine, but what's in that routine. The other thing we learned is that night awakenings were quite common. We actually used this to help inform our interpretation of the semi-structured interviews. We started to notice common patterns of co-sleeping, leaving the bed, or even if room sharing with a disruptive room neighbor, if you may. And that really helped us understand a lot more about this context of high screen time and short sleep. Most of it had to do with having the TV in the bedroom, which I know TV in the bedroom was something we thought about many years ago, but it's still in many people's bedroom. Now I'm going to move on to our third study. This was 436 parents of school-age children, so slightly older. It was a very similar sampling technique. We had fixed surveys in the morning, some random surveys within the day, and then another fixed survey at the end of the day. It was 7 days. We also incentivized for participation. What we were looking at here is the parent stress reported in the morning survey and how it related to what the parent reported on the child physical activity on the evening survey. And what we found was that parents' current day stress and coping was actually related to the frequent or was negatively related to child physical activity, but not screen time. We also found that among girls, higher parent stress and lower current day coping was related to their physical activity later in the day, especially in girls. I wanted to take a minute to really discuss some of this data. The biggest thing I want to highlight is if you do EMA, really consider looking across surveys and looking across days. As mentioned in the previous studies, a lot of these surveys look at mood and affect, and that doesn't just resolve within those 30 minutes. It really plays out into parenting behaviors throughout the day, even the next day. And so we saw here is that, again, the same day stress was related to less physical activity for the girls that day, but more the next day. So we may hypothesize that parents might have compensated the next day. Maybe they didn't do something on Tuesday, but on Wednesday we went to the park. So thinking about how that might come together, we hypothesized this didn't happen for boys because boys usually do structured activities like a sports practice, which usually doesn't change if a parent is stressed in the morning. The caveat to this is you need high compliance across multiple surveys. So it's not just having a morning survey with high completion, it's having across multiple days. So it's sometimes limited based on your data, but again, a good approach to really look at how it all comes together with parenting and physical activity and sedentary behavior. So today I talked about 3 separate studies, an adolescent study and 2 parent studies. And here we really just talked about the timing and prompts, the parent perspective, some considerations for fixed surveys, and using survey data across multiple days. I'd like to thank my funding, my institute. I'd really like to thank my collaborator and mentor, Jerica Berg, who helped with study 2 and study 3. And I'd also like to thank the people who I can't put their name up there, which are the participants. Thank you again. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all 3 of our speakers. That was very insightful and really helpful to see the use of EMA both in nutrition and physical activity contexts. And so now we would like to open the floor to the audience to ask any questions. I think you can, the easiest would be if you type your question into the Q&A. And maybe we'll give a couple minutes as people are typing, but I have a few sort of general questions for any of the panelists to take. So maybe I could start with one of those while audience members start typing. I guess, I mean, you mentioned how you used EMA, but in general, are there any apps that any of you would recommend researchers look into if they're considering using EMA? I know, Abi, you mentioned there are several in your presentation. Are there any you'd like to highlight specifically?
From experience, so I'm currently preparing a proposal that will use ecological momentary assessment again. So I've done lots of research when we were planning that study, but also for this project proposal. And it's really difficult because there are, I feel like technical issues always happen. The one that we used for the study that I presented on today, I wouldn't recommend. And we did pay quite a lot of money to use that as well. And I know that since then, there's been more and more platforms that are open source and that allow you to actually code your own EMA app. And especially with like the advancement of AI, I think it's becoming much more easy for people to code their own apps. So I know that there are several free ones that my colleagues have used. And I'm currently working with Movisense, which is a German-based company, purely because they also do physiological monitoring as well. So they'll combine it with like the Fitbit wearing or the heart rate accelerometry data as well.
Okay, and I guess Chelsea and Cindy, if you want to chime in on apps there.
I think Abi raised a lot of really good points. I have used Life Data. So study 1 and study 2 are Life Data, but Life Data does not incorporate with the wearable. And so I think it depends on how you're using the EMA. If you just do EMA by itself and some physical activity-based measure, then I would recommend Life Data. You can create it. It's pretty reasonable, but it's when you start to combine them is when you're going to need something that works together. So I will just say I recommend Life Data for just EMA.
Yeah, I think the Peel app that we used was it was good. It was free, and that's why we used it, because we didn't have a lot of money to do this particular study. And it was, yeah, I mean, we built the little program ourselves and, had to test it. And of course, like Abi says, there were definitely a few little issues here and there. And yeah, I think that with APIs for Fitbit and stuff, having that integrated would be great. I mean, I can still put that stuff together, but it has to be manual. And so that's why it's taken me so long to actually do that. So if you can have that automatic, then I would do that.
Okay. And actually, Cindy, there's a question in the chat for you. If you could please say more about the link between EMA and habit formation. And I actually had a similar question written down for you around habit formation, specifically around if ever the cues that they were given, like you mentioned that, if they had a bad day, they wanted to turn off cues potentially, but could it also have helped them with if they were choosing to not do the habit, getting the cue then led to doing the habit anyways. So overall, could you speak more to the link between EMA and habit formation?
Yeah, and I like I say, we are in the process of figuring this out with our current this study. It as a fellowship kind of side study, it got backburnered a bit, to be very honest. But I am getting back into it, which I think is still quite interesting. But I do think, yeah, it's the cues to action, isn't it? It's those prompts, those little things that you don't really think about. And that's what we were looking for, how to make it automatic. Like, where's the tipping point for automaticity in that sort of habit formation arena? And yes, I think that even if they're like, wake up, they're having the worst day, they feel terrible, they're just like, no, I'm not doing anything today. If they got this little prompt and they thought about it, that self-reflection that people were talking about in our interviews and whatnot, if they had a bit of time to think about it and they say, okay, no, I'm going to go out for a 15-minute walk, even that much time, or even 10 minutes, honestly. If somebody did something and then they felt better at the end of the day, that's what we're really interested in looking for. And like, that's what's ongoing. But yeah, there's been some evidence out there that shows, these little cues to action and helping build that habit formation leads to automaticity, and they don't even really think about it anymore. And some things are easier to do that. Some behaviors are easier to make automatic, like brushing your teeth and putting on a seatbelt. But, just getting up and doing activity is a little bit harder to make automatic. You can do your best, but yeah.
So thank you. And then Chelsea, I had a question for you. When you were talking about your future directions and around compliance with survey completion, was there any particular, I guess, rule you use to define good compliance versus not?
Yeah, good question. So there is an overall compliance metric that we look at, but what we were really looking at in our study is that we want people to complete that morning survey and 2 within-day surveys, because the morning survey had the most, I guess, rich data, or what was related to our hypothesis, rather than incentivizing everything. And so we were able to get a lot of people to do that, rather than the evening surveys as well. So that's what we looked at, was a morning survey and 2 within-day surveys. And so within our 14-day period for that study too, we check in 3 days in and say, oh, it looks like you have 2 complete days, and then check in a couple of days later and say, oh, it looks like you've achieved this many, you've already got this much money, and then we check in again. And I think that really helps them seeing that they got the money as it went, rather than at 14 days, how much did I have already? And also just checking in to make sure that they're using it. If anything comes up, we've had a couple people switch phones, or they all of a sudden turn their notification blocker on, really helped. But we looked at what was the most important for our primary research question, which was the morning survey and the 2 within-day surveys.
Right. Yeah, and surveys in general, it's always hard with compliance, and now there's several to complete. We'll still have a few minutes. I have one more sort of more general question for anyone to take, or maybe all of you could speak to. Are there any rules or any thoughts around not using EMA long enough, or using it for too short of a period? So there was, the 7 days seem to be kind of consistent, but is there too long or too short in terms of using this method?
I mean, I can speak to my own in that people were still doing it 6 weeks later. So it didn't seem like, and some of my colleagues at the University of Hull, because I've presented some methods and stuff around this before to some of our research groups, were quite surprised that people were keen and willing to keep doing it, especially like the 2 times a day for 6 weeks. They were kind of shocked. And I was like, well, I just, said, keep doing it as long as you want to. And then, 6 weeks was up, and we had you saw some people dropped off, but some people were still going for as long as they could. But yeah.
I'd like to highlight that the question is, how long would you go? But it depends on what you're asking. So if we did the 6 prompts, I don't think anyone would go for 6 weeks. And again, special kudos to Cindy for 6 weeks. That was very high compliance. So I think it's what you're asking. And also I like the idea with Cindy's when they paired it with the Fitbit, because if you're just getting the prompts, it's like, okay, where is this going? So I think if you do for longer, you're going to have to reduce the prompts and really get at the most important thing you want to get, because that's the thing with EMAs. You're so excited, you get to ask them during the day, but it's like, what are you going to ask? What are the most important things?
Yeah, making that kind of clear throughout as well is, kind of the key thing, I think.
All right, well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I will take this opportunity to once again thank our speakers. This webinar was brought to you through the ISBNPA, the Children and Family SIG, as well as the Cancer Prevention and Management SIG. But importantly, we wanted to choose a topic that hopefully broadly speaks to the members of ISBNPA, and this recording will live on the website so that we're able to continuously share with our members. Antonio, I don't know if you have any closing remarks from ISBNPA.
There's going to be a few other webinars in the coming weeks, so please go to our website to learn about that. And I hope to see you all in Cadiz. And thank you so much for all the presenters also. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. And whatever time of day it is, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or a good evening, or if you're just starting your day, I hope your day goes well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you.
Bye.